The map on the table was already wrong. Not because it was outdated, but because reality was moving faster than the pencils trying to keep up with it. Roads that should have been red with resistance were clear. German symbols were erased almost as quickly as they were drawn. Units intelligence expected to fight were dissolving instead. Prisoners came in small groups. Trucks were abandoned. Weapons lay in ditches. Patton stood over the Lorraine sector with both hands planted on the table, helmet pushed back, eyes fixed on one name: Metz. For centuries, Metz had been a fortress. Armies had bled themselves dry against it. Generals avoided it when they could, and paid dearly when they couldn't. But what Patton was seeing now was different. Not a fortress. Not yet. This was the moment before a city decided what it was going to become. Patton had seen this moment before, not in Metz, but anywhere speed had broken an enemy before defenses could harden. The instant when orders contradicted each other, when retreat and resistance collided. He knew how narrow that window was, and he knew how fast it closed. He didn't give a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said what the map was already showing. If we keep moving, Metz falls. No one argued. The officers saw the same reports. German units were pulling back instead of digging in. Fortifications were undermanned. The city had not been sealed. From the ground, Metz still looked like a door left ajar. But the answer didn't come from the room. It came from the system. Fuel requests stalled. Convoys were redirected. Supply priorities shifted without explanation. Orders arrived just late enough to matter. Not refusals, delays, pauses, adjustments. At higher headquarters, a different map sat on a different table. Eisenhower's staff wasn't balancing terrain alone. They were balancing alliances, supply lines, politics, and a front stretching faster than planned. British forces demanded priority. The advance across France had outrun its logistics. Something had to slow down. And Patton's army was moving the fastest. From that distance, Metz looked manageable, even optional. From Patton's position, it looked like the hinge of the entire campaign. He pressed again, calmly and precisely. Not for glory, not for speed itself. For time, hours, days. The difference between a city taken on the move and a fortress that would have to be crushed. This pause, he warned, is exactly what they need. Forward of headquarters, the army waited. Outside Nancy, engines idled. Tank crews slept on steel hulls. Infantry cleaned weapons they expected to use the next day. Recon patrols kept reporting the same thing. Resistance was light, scattered, uncertain. Germans were still leaving instead of standing. Then the reports changed. Not suddenly, quietly. German movement stopped flowing west and folded inward. Engineers appeared near old fortifications. Artillery that should have been retreating moved back toward concrete. Bridges were measured, not crossed. Across the Moselle, German officers were doing the same math Patton was. They understood American speed, and they understood what a pause meant. If the Americans stopped, even briefly, Metz could still be saved. Concrete didn't need courage. It didn't need inspiration. It only needed time. Inside Allied headquarters, no one used the word siege. The delay was called coordination, caution, a correction to momentum. But war doesn't pause evenly. Every hour the Third Army waited, Metz hardened. Guns were repositioned. Tunnels reopened. Orders went out that should never have existed. When fuel finally flowed again, and the advance resumed. Patton felt the difference immediately. Resistance was no longer improvised. Fire came from planned angles. Probes met answers instead of panic. The enemy wasn't guessing anymore. Metz had changed. The trap was no longer waiting for the Germans. It was forming around the men who now had to take the city after it finished becoming a fortress. And the cost of that pause had not yet appeared on any casualty list. Patton's fight was no longer with the Germans. It was with gravity, the pull of a system designed to flatten anything that moved too far, too fast. At his forward headquarters near Nancy, the situation felt obvious. German resistance was thin. Roads were still open. Recon units reported confusion instead of cohesion. Prisoners came in without escorts because they didn't expect to be attacked again if they stopped moving. The Third Army's advance had become something German commanders didn't understand. American columns appeared where they weren't expected. Units dissolved before contact. Defensive plans written only days earlier no longer matched reality. This wasn't chaos. To Patton, this was control. Speed wasn't recklessness. Speed was pressure applied before the enemy could think clearly. He believed that because he had watched hesitation ruin opportunity before. In North Africa, delay had cost lives. In Sicily, speed had broken resistance faster than any careful plan ever could. Metz, to him, wasn't history. It was a clock. Every hour mattered. Every pause shifted the balance from movement to resistance. He wasn't asking for permission to gamble. He was asking to finish what momentum had already started. But clocks looked different from above. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower faced a map that didn't reward instinct. The front was stretching east faster than supply lines could support it. Fuel stocks were tight. Rail networks were damaged. Ports were still being repaired. British commanders pressed for priority to sustain their own offensives. The alliance was a machine, and machines failed when one part surged ahead of the rest. Patton was becoming that part. No one questioned his results. That was the problem. His success threatened balance. If the Third Army surged too far, neighboring armies would be exposed. If one commander set the tempo, coalition control weakened. And if coalition control weakened, the entire strategy risked coming apart. So resistance took a quieter shape. Fuel allocations were rebalanced. Requests were acknowledged, then delayed. Convoys were rerouted without explanation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing written that said, "Halt." They didn't need to. Movement slowed just enough to matter. Patton pushed back through channels that moved slower than his tanks ever could. He argued in specifics, distances, timelines, enemy behavior. He warned that the Germans were already reacting to the pause, not with panic, but with calculation. He wasn't speculating. He was watching it happen. At his command post, tracing the Moselle with his finger, he said quietly to an aide, "They're not running anymore." That was the shift he feared most. German engineers appeared near the outer forts. Patrols reported organized resistance instead of scattered rear guards. Artillery fire came from prepared positions, not improvised ones. Defensive lines were being mapped instead of abandoned. The enemy wasn't guessing anymore. They were planning. Patton's frustration wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was cold. He understood exactly what was being traded away. Not glory, not headlines, lives. Speed protected infantry. Momentum shortened wars. Delay handed initiative back to an enemy who had already lost it once. Eisenhower saw something else. He saw a front that could tear if pushed unevenly. He saw political fallout if British forces stalled while American armies surged ahead. He saw the danger of letting any single commander, no matter how aggressive or effective, dictate the rhythm of a coalition war. Both men were acting rationally. Both were protecting what they believed mattered most. And that was the problem. Because while the argument stayed theoretical, the battlefield did not. Every hour spent balancing priorities gave the Germans another hour to restore their own balance on ground they already knew how to defend. The decision was never announced as a decision. It arrived disguised as logistics. And by the time tension turned back into movement, Metz was no longer a city caught mid-stride. It was a position waiting. The first warning did not come from headquarters. It came from the ground. Outside the village of Corny-sur-Moselle, an American patrol moved forward, expecting what it had seen for days: scattered resistance, rear guards, Germans more interested in escape than in fighting. Instead, the patrol walked into coordinated fire. Machine guns overlapped. Mortars fell with practiced timing. Artillery answered before radios finished calling for support. This was not fear. This was preparation. The patrol pulled back with casualties. That was new. At Patton's forward command post, the report landed beside a map still marked for rapid advance. He read it once, then again, slower. The words did not describe a collapsing enemy. They described fields of fire, prepared positions, guns already zeroed in. He looked up and said to his operations officer, "This is what waiting looks like." Fuel finally began to arrive in volume. Orders finally aligned. The machinery that had stalled started moving again. On paper, the problem appeared solved. On the battlefield, it was too late. The Third Army resumed its push toward Metz and felt resistance the way a man feels a wall in the dark. Sudden, solid, unforgiving. Units advanced expecting momentum and met structure instead. Fire came from positions that had been empty only days earlier. Inside Metz, German officers had not wasted a minute. Fort Drian, Fort Jeanne d'Arc, the outer ring of 19th-century defenses that once defined sieges, was being reactivated piece by piece. Crews manned guns abandoned weeks earlier. Tunnels were reopened. Ammunition moved underground. Fire plans were written, tested, adjusted. What had been a possibility became a system. Patton pushed anyway. He always did. Armor rolled forward and met artillery that already knew the range. Infantry crossed open ground and found machine guns placed to cover every approach. Attacks that should have punched through stalled against defenses that had not existed long enough to be worn down. At one briefing, Patton stabbed a finger toward Metz and said to his staff, "They didn't do this on their own. We gave them the time." No one argued. They didn't need to. Reports confirmed it hour by hour. German movements were no longer reactive. They were deliberate. Counterfire came faster. Positions overlapped. Withdrawal routes vanished. Every push forward cost more than the last. The point of no return had already passed. What Patton had tried to prevent was now unavoidable. Metz would not fall on the move. It would not collapse under pressure. It would have to be reduced deliberately, fort by fort, hill by hill, under conditions that rewarded defense and punished speed. The Germans understood this too. Radio intercepts showed the shift clearly. Orders spoke of holding ground instead of delaying action. Units that should have been retreating were told to dig in and bleed the Americans dry. The language changed, from survival to resistance. The pause had done its work. Patton could still win. The Third Army had the firepower, the manpower, and the will. But victory would now come at a price no one had planned for, and one that could no longer be avoided by urgency or argument. The collision was complete. From this moment forward, Metz was no longer a mistake waiting to be corrected. It was a consequence. The fighting around Metz did not explode. It settled in. What followed was not the chaos of pursuit, but the slow violence of positions that refused to move. The Moselle River became a line of tension instead of a boundary crossed. Hills that had barely mattered weeks earlier now dominated entire sectors. Every rise, every bend in the river, every patch of high ground became something men had to pay for. Fort Drian loomed over the approaches like a lid that would not lift. American infantry moved forward under early autumn rain, boots sinking into mud that clung to uniforms and slowed everything. Artillery thundered day after day against concrete that absorbed shells and kept firing back. Smoke hung low, turning advances into guesswork and withdrawals into confusion. This was exactly what Patton had feared. Each attack now required preparation. Each preparation gave the defenders more time. Platoons went forward, knowing the ground favored the enemy. Tanks edged into firing positions, aware that every slope might hide a gun already sighted in. Momentum was gone. Surprise was gone. What remained was persistence. Casualty reports began to change. During the dash across France, losses had been sharp but brief, spikes that faded as resistance collapsed. Around Metz, the numbers accumulated steadily. In the first week of sustained fighting near the forts, Third Army units took thousands of casualties. By October, losses across the Lorraine sector climbed into the tens of thousands, spread across regiments that had expected to keep moving east instead of bleeding in place. At a field hospital south of Metz, wounded men lay on stretchers waiting for evacuation, mud still caked on their boots. Medics worked without pause, hands raw, sleeves darkened. Some men asked when they would move again. Others did not ask anything at all. No one spoke openly about missed opportunities. They didn't need to. The thought sat between the cots, unspoken but shared. This didn't have to be this way. Patton pushed relentlessly. He demanded movement even when conditions punished it. He believed pressure was still the only language the Germans understood. But his greatest weapon, speed, was gone. What remained was endurance, and endurance favored the defender. The Germans understood the trade perfectly. Every day Metz held bought time. Every week tied down American divisions that might have been racing deeper into Germany. Units that should have been regrouping behind the lines dug in elsewhere, stiffened by the knowledge that the Americans were no longer breaking through. The delay at Metz rippled outward. Resistance hardened along other stretches of the front. Timetables shifted. Opportunities narrowed. What had begun as a localized pause now influenced the rhythm of the entire campaign. War had found its balance again. Inside Allied headquarters, the cost could no longer be hidden behind logistics or coordination. The maps still moved, but slower. Arrows shortened. The ledger filled with names instead of lines. The decision made quietly weeks earlier now demanded payment. Metz was no longer just a city. It was a bill coming due, paid one casualty report at a time. Metz fell in November, not in a rush, not in a sweep. It fell the only way it could now fall, piece by piece, fort by fort, under conditions that punished the attacker and protected the defender. By the time American forces broke the last organized resistance, the city no longer mattered the way it once had. The decision point was gone. The opportunity Patton had warned about in early September had closed so completely it was no longer visible on any map. What remained was the bill. The Third Army had spent weeks fighting for ground it should have crossed in days. Patton understood exactly what that meant. In private notes and later reflections, he returned to the same idea again and again. Speed was not recklessness. It was protection. Momentum kept soldiers alive by denying the enemy choices. Once that momentum was taken away, the enemy decided where and how the next fight would happen. That was the real outcome at Metz. German forces did not win the city. They bought time, and they used it well. The delay around Metz tied down American divisions that were supposed to be moving east. Units that could have been pressing deeper into Germany were instead consumed by concrete, rain, and prepared defenses. Artillery stocks were burned against forts instead of supporting pursuit. Infantry replacements arrived not to reinforce momentum, but to replace losses that never should have existed. The numbers made the point brutally clear. The Lorraine campaign cost the Third Army tens of thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. Spread across weeks of fighting, planners had never intended to fight there at all. Those losses were not the result of German brilliance. They were not the result of Allied weakness. They were the price of time handed back to an enemy who had already lost it. No official report ever framed Metz as a mistake. On paper, the decision to slow Patton made sense. Coalition warfare required balance. Supply lines were stretched. British forces needed fuel. The front had to be managed, not raced. Each justification was reasonable in isolation. Together, they produced a result no one intended, and no one formally owned. That is how costly decisions survive history. Metz did not become a scandal. It became a footnote, a necessary siege, an unfortunate delay, something that fit neatly inside staff logic and post-war explanations. But the battlefield told a simpler story. The pause allowed a fortress to reassemble. The fortress forced a siege. The siege consumed men and time that could never be recovered. Patton carried that lesson forward. When the Third Army finally broke loose later in the war, surging across Germany at a speed that stunned both allies and enemies, it demonstrated what had been possible all along. The capability had always been there. The men had proven it repeatedly. What changed was not the army. It was permission. Metz stood as proof of what happened when that permission was withheld. The men who paid for that decision were never present when it was made. They were not in headquarters rooms balancing alliance politics or fuel allocations. They were in muddy fields along the Moselle, advancing against forts that should never have been ready, under fire that should never have had time to be planned. The war moved on after Metz. Maps shifted. Arrows pointed east again. But the cost remained, embedded in casualty lists and delayed timelines, invisible unless someone went looking for it. That is the reckoning Metz leaves behind. Not a story about failure, a story about caution, and about what caution costs when it meets an enemy who understands time as well as Patton did. Metz was taken in the end, but the war paid for it far longer than it ever needed to.